So hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. It's great to see you all here. My name is Cora Halsworth. I'm Manager of Municipal Programs at the BCIT British Columbia Institute of Technology Center for Ecocities. I'll be facilitating today's webinar, and I'm supported by presentations and guided discussions from my colleagues and fabulous guest speakers. So please note that we're recording this webinar so we can make it available later for those that couldn't attend in person. So just a few quick reminders. We do ask you please mute yourself unless you're speaking, and feel free to use the webinar, the chat feature in the webinar tool to pose any questions or comments that you have during the webinar. We love chat comments, and we can answer some of those questions as they come up in chat. And I wanted to flag that this webinar is part of the webinar series hosted by the BCIT Center for Ecocities Peer Network. It is being made possible with the generous support of the Real Estate Foundation of BC. And we'd very much like to thank our guest speakers for today, whom I'm going to introduce you to very shortly. I'd like to respectfully and gratefully acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Turtle Island on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples, represented by the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and the WSÁNEĆ peoples, represented by Tsartlip, Pecouchin, Sayout, Sycam, and Malahat nations, known by settlers to this land as Greater Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. So in chat, I'd love for you to let us know what community you work with and provide your own territorial acknowledgement. Please also consider renaming yourself in your window to include the name of the city that you represent, or local government or other organization that you represent. So you can do that by clicking on your window and at the top right and renaming yourself. Before I start, I'll introduce myself with more detail and our guest speakers. So again, I'm Cora Halsworth, managing Ecocity initiatives and municipal programs at British Columbia Institute for Technology's Center for Ecocities. I'm also principal of CHRM Consulting, a Victoria-based consulting firm, and senior associate with One Earth Living, a Vancouver-based nonprofit. I've been working on community sustainability and climate action for over 20 years, and currently lead these municipal programs at BCIT, including the Ecocity Peer Network, which is helping municipalities develop, understand, and act on their ecological footprints and in consumption-based emission impacts. I also lead in collaboration with One Earth Living, One Planet Saanich, through which we're working with communities and organizations in the district of Saanich to develop One Planet action plans focused on targeted footprint reduction in collaboration with the municipality. I'm joined by my colleagues, Vanessa Timmer and Blake Robinson. Vanessa is Executive Director of One Earth Living, which is a non-profit think and do tank, creating and imagining sustainable ways of living in cities around the world. She's also a senior research fellow at Utrecht University, and she studied at Queen's University, Oxford, UBC, and Harvard. One Earth is a global leader on sustainable lifestyles, and really important that she's here with us today. So Blake currently leads a multi-year collaboration between Urban Future Studio at Utrecht University and African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, focusing on innovative, sustainable infrastructure for African cities. They combine research on sustainable technologies and approaches with creative futuring techniques to reimagine infrastructure for more sustainable African cities and accelerate change. And so it's great that Blake is here today with us. I can share a lot of knowledge about international examples on sustainable lifestyles. So welcome to both of our guest speakers. So our agenda for today, I'll start with a background on the BCIT Center for Ecocities and the Ecocity Peer Network. Then Vanessa and I will set context for our webinar, which explores city and local government roles in advancing sustainable lifestyles. I'll explore some of the traditional and additional roles that we're calling these, local governments that are already undertaking to advance sustainable lifestyles through climate action. And we'll then take a short, a 5 to 7 minute small group discussion time. And we haven't let you know about this ahead of time, so hopefully you're okay with it. We would love for you to break out into small groups to discuss some of these opportunities that you're interested in or already undertaking in your community. And since I haven't let you know about this ahead of time, feel free to either just keep your camera off, and you're also welcome to just take a short coffee break at that time too, if you prefer. But we love, terrific for you to join these small group discussions. We think it would be a great opportunity to meet some of your colleagues from across the country. So great opportunity to meet some new people. Followed by this discussion, we'll then have Blake provide an overview of what we call next level roles for cities to advance sustainable lifestyles. And we'll have a full group discussion on these next level opportunities and wrapping up with a closing. So I'll start with this first, looking at some background on BCIT's Center for Ecocities. So we support the evolution of Ecocities, including supporting research, providing tools, metrics, expert planning and policy advice, training and other services that cities and their partners need to become genuine ecocities. A cornerstone of our work is the Ecocity Peer Network, in which we're supporting communities in understanding and acting on their ecological footprint and consumption-based emissions impacts. This work has been funded by Real Estate Foundation of BC and Vancity Credit Union. And so you'll hear a bit more about this work today. At the center, key metrics that we use to inform transition to socially just cities that are in balance with nature are the ecological footprint and consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions. We developed these assessments using the tool created by Dr. Jenny Moore, who's joining us today. And this tool is currently freely available for use by municipalities on request. Dr. Moore's tool was first prototyped and tested with Metro Vancouver and British Columbia, and results were adopted by Vancouver in its Greenest City Action Plan. Since then, we've used the tool to develop inventories for dozens of communities in Canada and around the world, and we've been working with BC communities to help them evaluate and work with these metrics closely. And you can find more about our work on our website. I'll provide a quick overview of the two consumption-based sustainability metrics that we focus on at the center. And these are core to advancing sustainable lifestyles. So first, I just wanted to run a quick poll, and Christine's going to run that for me. We'd like to know what your level of familiarity is with these two metrics. So first, the ecological footprint. I'll pause while you fill out this poll. So the question, how would you rate your level of knowledge on ecological footprint? Excellent. So here we go. We've got a range of knowledge. There's a few people with very limited knowledge, and I think I know who the expert is in the room. So thanks for that. We have one other question on the consumption-based. Oh, did I not share those results? Did you see them? Great. Okay, here's your next poll, consumption-based emissions inventory. How would you rate your level of knowledge on consumption-based emission inventories? Excellent. That looks like we have a mixture on that too, with a bit more knowledge on the CPIs. So that's great. Thanks so much. So both of these metrics provide important information, as I said, when seeking to advance sustainable lifestyles. The ecological footprint is a measurement tool we can use to figure out how close or how far we are from one planet living. And consumption-based emissions inventories help us determine the greenhouse gas emission impacts of consumption within a region. Quickly looking at the ecological footprint, scientists have estimated the amount of biologically productive area on the Earth, and we divide that by the number of people on Earth to figure out what our fair share is. Right now, we are in global ecological overshoot, using an average of 70% more of the planet's resources than it can regenerate. So if everyone consumed at the levels we do in Canada, we'd need the equivalent of 5 Earths worth of land area to sustain us. With consumption-based emissions, this chart here shows the difference between a traditional way of measuring inventories conducted in local governments and also other levels of government with the consumption-based inventory. So the sector-based or traditional territorial inventory is in the blue, and the consumption-based inventory is in the green. The traditional sectoral-based inventory only considers the impacts of emissions generated locally, plus the impacts of imported electricity from handling our waste. And I think all of you are familiar with that. Many of you are responsible for these types of inventories. And in contrast, the consumption-based approach also includes the energy emissions that went into producing all the things we use in our daily lives, no matter where they're produced. So this factors in the embodied emission impacts of all the material and energy that was used in creating our built environment, producing our goods and food, and also out-of-boundary travel. And then it excludes those things that are exported. So importantly, these are complementary inventories. The CBI does not replace the sectoral inventory. It's important to track what's being generated locally as well through industry. But the CBI is also an important lens to provide a complete picture of the impacts of our activities. And this is where the lifestyles come in, looking at the impacts of individual and household level consumption. So these consumption-based inventories help encourage strategies that will maximize global, not just local emission reductions. In this way, we can better understand our fair share of emission impacts. And we have more recorded webinars on our websites that provide additional detail on the ecological footprint and consumption-based emissions, if you'd like to look into them at a future date as well. So some may think of Canada as a relatively small contributor to climate change, but this chart using a consumption-based perspective reveals a different story. Based on cumulative consumption-based emissions from each of the countries over the past 170 years, Canada ranks in the top 10. And we're still, from a per capita basis, we're number one. And this is because of our high consumption lifestyles, our dependence on fossil fuels for heating, and for transporting us around our large country. And many of us around the world are consuming way more than our planet's resources, way more of our planet's resources, and importing these resources from other regions, more so than what the planet can sustain for us. So we are, in a sense, offshoring these emissions associated with producing them. This chart shows that here in Canada and many other places around the world, we're pretty far from a sustainable lifestyle. In Canada, we're overshooting our target for staying within 1.5 degrees of warming by about 6 times. Also interesting is the impact of food, which is typically excluded from a traditional community-based emission inventory. And consumer goods also make up a larger contribution when you look at upstream impacts, not just looking at waste handling. So interest in using a consumption-based emission inventory approach is growing around the world. In addition to the work we've done with cities at the Center for Ecocities, C40 Cities has also developed over 80 CBIs, consumption-based emission inventories for communities. And significantly, last year, Sweden became the first country to include consumption-based emission in targets within their climate targets. Local governments have already demonstrated great leadership in climate action dating back to the early 90s. City of Toronto was the first city to set a climate target. And here in Canada, cities began participating in the PCP program in the early 90s, as you all well know. International collaboration networks for cities have been created over the last 20 years to accelerate progress. And as part of this leadership, we're now seeing the emergence of a consumption-based approach to national and local inventories. Today, we're going to explore these traditional, additional, and next level roles for cities in advancing sustainable lifestyles that will contribute to climate, nature, and biodiversity goals. So as you know, many of the traditional roles that local governments take are in these 3 bucket areas, looking at buildings, transportation and land use, and waste. So we know that there are opportunities to deepen these actions as well. Traditionally when we work on climate and energy at the local level, this involves actions that focus on shifting to low carbon energy sources and improving the efficiency of buildings. But when we take a consumption-based approach, this means we need to start looking at the embodied or upstream emissions, which are associated with construction of these buildings, as well as upstream impacts of energy sources. Some leading examples are cities like Vancouver, that is now tracking embodied emissions of buildings, and they've also set targets for embodied carbon targets for new buildings. Cities like Vancouver and Portland are also requiring minimum salvage or deconstruction levels for older buildings and minimum reuse and recycling targets as well. There are also think tank groups focusing the shift to low carbon buildings like Carbon Leadership Forum and ZX. This also means we need to, another additional area we can look at is making deeper reductions in the built environment by looking at right-sizing our buildings and making sure they're efficiently used. For example, cities like Portland, Oregon, and Austin, Texas are exploring new tax and permitting incentives for smaller and more fully utilized homes. Similar to the efforts on buildings, transportation-focused actions focus on fuel sources and efficiency through mode shift. But from a consumption-based perspective, we see that it is important to also focus on embodied emissions, which make an even stronger argument for shifting away from private vehicles through reduced mobility demand, achieved through compact development, and more emphasis on active transportation and transit. Excitingly, many communities are making permanent those bicycle lanes that were created, the bicycle and pedestrian lanes that were created during COVID. So these are being converted into permanent bicycle lanes and taking over roadways that were previously occupied by vehicles, making them usable by bicycles and pedestrian. So all of this activity is accelerating the shift away from passenger vehicle travel. Digging deeper on waste is about addressing the root cause of our waste challenge by looking at consumption itself. It's about acknowledging that the materials and energy that go into producing stuff vastly overshadows the waste that individuals throw out in their personal lives. Leading cities are now helping to encourage residents simplify their lives and rethink purchases through community supports, making sure that the knowledge and infrastructure is accessible to share, reuse, repair, and extending lifespan of the various products we use in our day-to-day lives. And there are many circular initiatives taking place in cities that are being well profiled through the Circular Cities and Regions Initiative. Many representatives are joining us here today. So I won't go into detail on them here, but some highlights are things like the resourceful campaigns like those in Portland and Citra's Sustainable Everyday Living campaign, and the many supports for share, reuse, repair infrastructure like the Rituna Mall in Sweden. In terms of food, we know that impacts of food are not typically addressed in local government and climate action work, yet they're responsible for nearly a quarter of many Canadian communities' consumption-based emissions. Even more strikingly is the fact that much of the food that is produced is wasted. According to the UN, 1/2 of all fruit and vegetables produced each year is thrown away. And Blake is going to dig into some of these opportunities with you further as we see this as a next level opportunity space. So when we use a lifestyle or consumption-based approach, priorities are expanded and opportunities for impact are dramatically increased. To recap, in addition to energy efficiency and fuel switching, we'll make greater gains if we right-size our buildings and use spaces more efficiently. We can also have greater impact if we go beyond switching to electric vehicles and instead focus on reducing demands for vehicle-based travel. We can also pivot from emphasizing recycling and waste management to prioritizing circular opportunities that reduce consumption of raw materials. And we can achieve dramatic reductions in our footprint and emissions if we prioritize reducing food waste across the supply chain and also shift to low carbon food choices. A number of the communities we've been working with are taking action on consumption-based emissions and ecological footprint. City of Vancouver is using the footprint as a core target and have used this as a core target in the Green City Action Plan, and now also have aggressive targets on embodied emissions for buildings. District of Saanich is using the consumption-based emissions inventory to inform their climate plan. And we have launched the One Planet Saanich initiative with them to help encourage community members, organizations to act on footprint reduction. And I know that many of you are working on similar exemplary initiatives. Wanted to highlight that this focus on consumption has been particularly emphasized in the last few years in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. So last year, for the first time, the IPCC included a summary of how lifestyle changes and behavior changes could contribute to meeting our global targets. They found that lifestyle and behavior change could contribute 40 to 70% of these emission reductions needed by 2050. So before we get into the rest of the content, I'd love to break out into small groups. So I want to now hand over to Vanessa Timmer, who is going to explore some of explore the full scope for sustainable lifestyles, the benefits, the importance of breaking down silos and framing, and the power of positive narrative. So thank you, and over to you, Vanessa.
Thanks, Cora. Yeah, we had a great conversation also about how do we measure this moving forward. I'm sure a lot of the cities and towns are wondering that, and I think one thing that we've really been exploring in the sustainable lifestyles and behavior change space is how we actually measure the full breadth of not just the drawdown of footprints, be it ecological or consumption-based, but also how that links to social tensions we're experiencing and inequalities within our communities, as well as increased well-being. And so when we define sustainable living, it's really about those three aspects. It's really a connection point between how do we live good lives justly within the ecological limits of the earth. And so the metrics really, powerful metrics are ones that really connect the dots amongst those different elements. And I want to pick up from where Cora was just speaking about the way in which lifestyle and behavior change is being picked up globally and has been gathering steam. And I think some of you might be also being asked to really dive into scope 3 emissions as part of that conversation, in terms of seeing how we're connected to other parts of the planet. And I just want to add one piece to what Cora mentioned about the 40 to 70% emission reduction potential by 2050 of lifestyle and behavior change solutions. And the other part to that statement is that only is possible with the right infrastructure, sociocultural factors, policies in place, and technologies in place. And so that's why cities and towns have such a critical role, because we shape the context in which people live our lives. And in addition to the IPCC picking it up, let me just show you that last year in June, I was in Stockholm for a gathering on a high-level forum on sustainable consumption, which brought together key players from across city governments, business, civil society, international organizations. And there was really a deep dive into the potential of the role cities can play, hosted by the city of Stockholm and C40 cities. And we've seen it being picked up as well in November of last year in the Sharm el-Sheikh in the COP27 Climate Summit's outcome report. The first paragraphs actually talk about lifestyles. So it's within the first page, you're seeing that climate targets will only be achieved when we note the importance of transitioning to sustainable lifestyles and sustainable patterns of consumption and production. And also that we need to create an educational approach around this that promotes a shift in lifestyles. And this is a really interesting second part, while fostering patterns of development and sustainability based on care, community, and cooperation. And so that's a different development paradigm than one that's focused just on growth or extraction, but is really focused on what's the well-being and care, community, and cooperation we're wanting to build. And so in that's November, December of last year, the Global Biodiversity Framework was passed. And look at what's inside the target. So target 16 is about ensuring that people are encouraged and enabled to make sustainable consumption choices, including by establishing supportive policy, legislative, regulatory frameworks, improving education, access to relevant and accurate information about alternatives, so that the global footprint of consumption in an equitable way is reduced, including through having global food waste, reducing overconsumption, reducing waste generation, and living in harmony with Mother Earth. So this is the goal that globally is being set, and I'm sure you're seeing that within your city targets. But the interesting link is there when Cora was saying about bridging silos. The opportunity is really there to connect this sustainable ways of living approach across health, economic development, biodiversity, climate, sustainability, and different domains such as waste, food, built infrastructure, transportation within your cities and towns. We're also seeing it in businesses. So IKEA has a new strategy. Their ambition by 2030 is to inspire and enable more than 1 billion people to live a better everyday life within the boundaries of the planet. And that's the large businesses as well as small and medium-sized businesses. And the good news is that people are ready. 2 in 3 people in 31 countries have said that they're prepared to have their consumption to help save the planet. And so this healthy and sustainable living is really on the rise. And so it's going to be requested and also expected of cities and towns to support people in living these sustainable ways of living. And in our conversation, we were talking in the breakout about how do we measure this? What are the metrics? How do we know that we're having the highest impact? And it's really interesting because even though people are ready to take action, they're also not clear about what the most impactful action can be. So when surveyed, actually they underestimate the biggest emission areas and overestimate the ones that we've been communicating very powerfully. So you can see here that recycling is the highest footprint perceived action, whereas we know that actually the amount of emissions reduced by just recycling is small compared to avoiding, for example, a long distance flight or moving away from car dependency or shifting to renewable energy. So part of what a city can do is to expand the way we talk about sustainable ways of living, and particularly waste management, for example, beyond the recycling to actually talking about sufficiency, enoughness in our lives. How do we really amp up our discussion about reducing for those that are consuming, over-consuming, reusing, as well as recycling? How about repairing? And there's a lot of interest in that, as I'll show you in a moment. So this point that I want to make is that this is not just a technical challenge, it's a narrative challenge. And one of the most interesting things about diving into sustainable ways of living is understanding that people do actions for different motivations. We did a survey in the British Columbia, and that's also been picked up in the city of Guelph. And we just are finishing a new fully motivations insight study in Quebec, in the province of Quebec. And what we found is that there was many more people taking sustainable actions than those who are what we would call in the eco niche, those who are focused on or doing these actions motivated by climate or the planet. People were motivated to repair or take transit or make sure that their house is energy efficient or the right size, or shifting the way they're using their goods to be, for example, lasting longer, or shifting their food towards plant-based food, or reducing their food waste for many different reasons. So, for example, in BC, the largest cohort was not necessarily focused on the planet, but on frugality. They didn't want to be wasteful. That was their main motivation. And the second largest group in the BC Insight study was a group called Shop, Style, and Social. So they actually changed their behaviors and connect to sustainable living by watching what others are doing. So it's a very social reference. So that's where it becomes important to tell stories about what others in the community are doing, or to create much more social engagement, repair cafes that bring communities together, for example, really taking a social approach to how we bring sustainable living into your cities and communities. And so that expanding of our audience of who our policymaking is for, but also allowing that story to emerge. And you can use these motivations within your cities and towns in BC, but also we'll be picking that up in Quebec, and also we're in conversation in Alberta and Ontario to bring this work there. In terms of communication, I have some guides to show you. So One Earth Living was part of developing this Urban Sustainable Directors Network Sustainable Consumption Toolkit, which we'll send you a reference for. And within that, Kara Pike, who is now doing Reclimate, a sustainable communications and understanding behavioral insights program across Canada. She helped us develop this smart shift, how we communicate about sustainable consumption from the perspective of municipalities. So again, a great reference for how you can talk to others in your departments, but also to your community about shifting to sustainable ways of living. So it's about framing and engagement. We did that on a global level with this report on fostering and communicating sustainable lifestyles, with some really interesting case studies and examples embedded in there that can also support your communication and framing work. And with the Beacon for Sustainable Living, we are also focusing on cities, but also communication and framing, and looked at different communications campaigns around the world. And the reason why all of this is important is because the way we frame as cities and towns what the good life looks like really influences the way people live in the city. And we've also seen the opposite. You know, a lot of the Western way of living has been promoted around the planet through what people see in the media, through through educational systems, through social influence. So, for example, you see in Malaysia that there's you know, a real, and in the Philippines you see that the kind of Western dress. So in offices and sitting by the Christmas fire and wearing wool clothes, which is not connected to what the experience of the country and the heat of the country. And so this pushing out of this Western idea of the British Christmas sitting by the fire, or what a good office dress looks like, has actually influenced people's daily lives. Because if you're in an office wearing a wool suit, it requires a certain built environment with air conditioning, etc. And so when we think much more about adapting to our sustainable ways of living that are connected to place, it becomes really important to tell stories that are much more about the good life in that particular context, rather than spreading the kind of a Western ideal about what a life is supposed to look like. And this has actually been an active, we know that consumer society has been an active creation, this cultural creation. Here is Victor Lebeau, who was one of the big architects of the consumer society, and of how advertising played a role in a world in which, you know, you can never have enough, and you need to keep accumulating more. Those with the most stuff win, kind of thing. So this is a quote from Victor Lebeau, who was trying to move people away from a wartime experience of being frugal to one in which they were over consuming. And the strategy really was about our enormously productive economy, which was built, of course, for the war as well, was now pushing out consumer products, demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction and our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced, and discarded at an ever increasing pace. So this whole idea that this manufacturing of needs, of creating of wants, this is the world that you as cities and towns are in. And so how do we start shifting this consumer society messaging, and knowing that people are already ready for that change? They're getting exhausted by living within this consumer society where they never have enough, and need to keep replacing their goods. But it's still a big part of what we're experiencing, the new, the novel, the constant consuming. And we see it everywhere, right? It's in the clickbait and disinformation on social media, product placement, how it influences our public institutions in terms of like how universities become influenced by corporate advertising structure, and it shows up in our public spaces. And you might say, well, what can I do as a city? And Blake will go into it more, but here's one example. You know, Grenoble actually decided to remove billboards from their public spaces to really create global commons where people are not seeing advertising as the main thing when they're moving around their city. And I just want to note that, you know, when I was saying earlier that people's perspective of the good life is shifting, the World Business Council and Sustainable Development did these really interesting studies, including the Good Life 2.0 and Future of Food and Future of Home. And they looked into Instagram to see that people are actually shifting what they're looking for. So instead of just living large, many are looking to be connected. Instead of driving solo and kind of being on your own, about sharing journeys, instead of slicing it thick, people want to know their food. Instead of pouring it on, people want to spend it wisely. Instead of throwing away, people want to hold on to it. instead of getting it fast, people want to slow down. So this isn't all of society. Definitely there's a hyper-consumption mode still very active, but there's many who are seeking these other ways of being, and how you shape your cities and towns can support this change, these patterns and trends. And also we should look to Indigenous communities who are shifting their practices and have a lot of traditional practices and rituals that are about reciprocity and respect and relationship with each other, with spirit, with the land. And they're also incorporating new technologies in building their communities. So it's this connection about ways of living that have that are technology enabled, but are also very much about the traditions and rituals of our lives. And we definitely need to start shifting these narratives, because we can really start to envision what a possible future could look like. I'm part of a team that's developing these 4 scenarios of possible sustainable living futures, including one that's based on design world that's really shaped by government, business, and cities, or global commons in which a new development paradigm and care is at the heart, and much more global South leadership, or big village, which is a very deep decentralization where people go into more village structures, or pocket lifestyles where people are sharing new sustainable lifestyle practices with peer-to-peer technologies. So if you want us to bring these future scenarios to your community, we can have these rich conversations about what life could be like. And we really need to shift the narrative, because what's been happening is more is better has been the predominant narrative. We've seen the expansion of housing, which requires more goods, which requires more energy, and often requires more land for transport. How do we start shifting that in a different direction? And we think one of the most powerful solutions is actually tapping into moments when people's lives are already changing, what we're calling these big life moments. Because, for example, when you're moving house, you end up creating a lot of waste, which cities and towns have to deal with. So how do we actually make these transition moments very sustainable, equitable, and increasing well-being? So big life moments is really about imagining every time that people make a change, from a young adult to moving house, to immigrating, to having a child, to starting a new career, to retiring and becoming an elder. At those moments, we can actually transition to joyful, climate-friendly, nature-friendly ways of traveling, living, working, consuming, and playing. And this isn't about giving people lists of what they need to do at that time. It's about actively supporting them in their communities with enabling policies, business models, and provisioning of basic services, and a cultural transition, so that people really get a sense of what a good life, what does it mean to live a good life as a young adult, or a new immigrant, or a retiree that's sustainable. So the reason why this is so powerful is because this offers solutions from cities and towns where people are at in these dynamic change moments. And we can really build in a whole lifestyle approach where we give them support across housing, transport, food, mobility, and leisure options, and ways to connect to their community. And it scales deep into culture, because when we change our lives, these are often moments of shifting identities, or where we're looking for rituals about what it means to become a parent or a young adult. So people are really seeking guidance and information at that time. They need and want support from a city, from the businesses and community groups around them. And they're shifting group membership. So it's a chance to really reinforce and mainstream sustainable living. So I would encourage you as cities and towns to think of these moments as really powerful. I know we were talking in my breakout group, what's a powerful way of intervening? Big life moments could be that powerful moment of intervening to get cascading effects across footprint reductions, allowing those who don't have enough to get to the right footprint level, doing it in an equitable, well-being way. And this is the city of Portland that's doing that with Resourceful PDX. They're actually putting this support system connected to these moments of change. And they built on that even more with the Share Use Repair Initiative shift workshops, where they really looked at the motivations within the city of Portland and shaped this strategy around growing family, moving house. So each of you on the city as cities might want to pick that one up as well. There's a general movement around sharing cities. So really thinking about some of these strategies across the different domains. So really thinking, how do we encourage sharing in a large scale? And And the Sherry's Repair Initiative is doing both connecting to businesses, but also the cultural change and the government change so that we shift both the supply of Sherry's Repair as well as the cultural demand for that supply. And one of the things that's coming out from Sherry's Repair Initiative is this great study on how people connect with their stuff. And what's really interesting about the categories of opportunity is that you see that's not just about stuff, it's about how people live their lives. So people want useful stuff that lasts longer. They also want flowing stuff that moves to them and away from them in a flow. So they don't necessarily need to own something, but they can lease it or borrow it and then move it on for reuse. But what's really interesting is you also see that people are talking about stuff in their lives from other perspectives, like connecting to nature through their stuff. And also joyful stuff. So this is the idea of like creating joy. And I want to really emphasize as a last point here that often when we think about these footprint studies or about consumption-based emissions, we come from the perspective of how do we shift consumption of, these high impact areas like built environment, transport, goods, food. And I would encourage us, for sure, we need to do those types of initiatives that really support and enable low carbon living. One of the most powerful things we can do is broaden our perspective from those domains to ask the question, how do we create joyful, one planet lives that tap into the full richness of our lives? Because it's not just these our lives. We don't wake up in the morning and say, oh, I'm going to be a great consumer today. We say, I want to live a really good life. And that means that we think about all the aspects of life that matter, from our health to our feeling of belonging, to our feeling of purpose, to our connection to spirit and nature and to each other, to basically how we shape communities and shape the bold policies of cities and business and the bold actions by business, being part of that shaping of the future. So I would encourage you as cities and towns to take a very sustainable ways of living approach that connects across these domains, because the power lies in that broader perspective. For example, the faster people need to live their lives, the more they overconsume, because they have to take the car quickly or buy something quickly for a birthday party or eat some fast food quickly. So what we found, or the bigger their lives are, bigger houses, more staff, more things to take care of, also the more we overconsume. So, we can think of lighter lives that are slower and maybe more closer together. We can also think of lives that are lighter because we have maybe more private austerity, more public luxury. So think about how you as a city or a town are shaping your parks, your libraries, the places where people gather, because those are critical to shaping our ways of living that are more light on the earth, and how you might be shaping the leisure activities that a city will engage in. And so to go more into that, we're going to hear from Blake in a minute, but I just wanted to see if there's any questions that people might have about thinking about bridging across silos, this narrative framing and the importance of that, and the richness of coming from a better life, as opposed to just thinking about what we need to draw down or reduce.
Vanessa, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much. It's been always great to participate in your sessions. And thank you everybody for participating. Overconsumption, that's I think the source of all of our issues. But the challenge is whenever we try to start this conversation, there is always resistance. Maybe a few suggestions how to start this conversation to take the people out of that offensive mode and bring them on board.
Oh, I love this question, Taj. Absolutely. I think this has been the biggest framing problem of our movement. We've almost always started from the numbers. This is the climate reductions we need. And that leads to a lot of no's. Less driving, less red meat, less housing, right? So the story has been one of reduction. And I think one of the most powerful things we found is that when we flip it around, we ask people, what do you value and love about your community? it's interesting. Almost nobody says a hamburger, right? Like maybe there's a few, but most people don't say, I love to commute for hours in my car, right? Like that's not the first thing that comes up. So it's really interesting when we start from what people value, we often get at more of what matters kind of piece of that. So, that's what we can start with. The other thing that we found is that people can't picture a different kind of way of life because of this fact that we've been steeped in a soup of advertising a particular way of living. And so another powerful thing we found is also crafting together with a community a vibrant sense of alternative ways of living, and also even seeing within a community who's already living those lives. And so that's another piece that we found has really worked well. And the final thing I'll say is that that often we find there's really powerful entry points that help. So asking people, I've given one example of an entry point, which is, helping people shape their lives at these big life moments means that we might not need to go back to them about overconsumption later, because that's the moment when their habits are already in flux. And if we can let them support them in living a sustainable life at that moment, then we're already supporting them in a way that shifts their behavior for decades. Just that moment is really powerful. But there's other powerful entry points, like starting to talk about food, like entering through food has been a hugely powerful one, because it does a number of things. It connects people to land and place. It's also deeply cultural. So people talk about rituals of food. Often, there's a lot of connection happens in gardens, but it's also about not wasting food is such a logical that it actually moves us away from feeling that that's about something being taken away and much more into a generative discussion. So those are some of the things we have found have worked, but I'd love to hear if there's other solutions that other cities and towns would like to bring forward. And also feeling you're not alone, right? I think doing this in groups, we found that to be extremely helpful as a neighborhood, as a workplace, with One Planet Saanich as a whole, that kind of thing. Are there other comments and questions about just responding to Taja's question, or other questions for me before I pass it on to Blake?
I can share some statistics. We keep a good track of our statistics in Nanaimo. And Nanaimo has been almost, I think, forefront of recycling since 80s. Through the pandemic, we saw about 22% increase in the volume of the recycling materials. And now it's dropped back by almost that 20% in the first few months of this year, and the trend is continued. I am trying to find out what the reasons are, and that's why I'm sharing this information. Is it because of the economy is going down, because people are more now careful, because now they're spending money more outside because they used to stay home for almost 2 years? Any insight would help me.
Oh, that's very interesting. Have others found that as well in their communities, that there's been a shift in recycling or other practices because of COVID?
Some not as significant as ours, and our statistics is very accurate. I don't know about other municipalities, and because some of them there is some lagging information, but yes, I think it's been trend. The challenge is that while recycling material is reduced, but garbage is still almost the same as it is.
Yeah.
I think habits definitely changed over COVID, and there's been service disruptions in some communities as well. So then that reduces momentum around those habits. And yeah, general consumption shifts in terms of people taking out food a lot more. So
yeah, and Denise, did you want to jump in there as well on this point? Okay, great. Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing about, and actually I'll put into the chat as well the links to some of the resources I mentioned, and I'll also put in one that was about COVID practices shifting. It was during COVID, but it's maybe there's two that I think would be of interest around this particular aspect, and also how they're shifting back again. So Cora spoke about the traditional aspects of what a city and town does to shape people's lives being enhanced. So around the built environment, transportation, goods, and she started to talk about food as well as part of the footprint review. I'm now going to turn it over to Blake. Blake has experience all over the world, as Cora was mentioning, has worked with the International Resource Panel, for example, as well, and is now focusing on infrastructure in Africa that can really support sustainable ways of living. He's originally from South Africa. And he's going to talk about these next level aspects that would also be key for cities and towns to know that this is part of what can support sustainable ways of living, and that these are aspects that you can pick up within your city and town. So food, leisure, sustainable innovation, experimentation, thinking about who could be an ambassador for sustainable living, creating defaults for sustainable choices, nature regeneration, advertising, and culture. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Blake.
Thanks, Vanessa, and good day, everybody. So as Vanessa mentioned, we have put together a list of 8 potential interventions that we consider next level in terms of moving beyond what cities normally look at and see as part of their role in sustainability transitions. And it's perhaps not surprising that our first of the 8 relates to the food system. Cora mentioned earlier the huge impact of food in terms of emissions, and also the significant volumes of waste that are generated in the food system. It typically, the figure that people normally use when looking at city food waste is about 1/3 of waste that comes into cities, of food goes to waste. And it's estimated that over half of fruit and vegetables that come into the city go to waste. So it's really a significant volume. And when you think of all the resources and water and fuel that's gone into producing food, and also in many places the deficit in nutrition, it's really a big problem. And so we think that looking at food from a systemic perspective is a really useful way in which cities can help to create more opportunities for sustainable living within the city. And one option is integrated food policies, and I'll give an example after this, where cities look holistically at food from the point of entry to the food waste at the end of the system, and look at ways in which you can improve and tweak the system to significantly reduce the emissions associated with food. There's also ways in which cities can look at procurement of local sustainable food so that they are supporting those producers to be able to scale themselves, and also providing a default option in terms of more sustainable food for staff and various institutions in the city. And then land use and zoning, looking at how open pieces of land could be used more effectively to support a more sustainable food system. An example that some of you might have heard of is the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which has been signed by over 200 cities around the world and has a number of interventions. I think it's about 40 different interventions that cities can take to make their city's food system more sustainable. And it focuses on 6 key themes, looking at things from food production to distribution to food waste, but also looking at issues of equity and nutrition and other important aspects in a sustainable food system. The city of Copenhagen has what they call an organic conversion policy that targets procurement and training across 900 kitchens in the city. The city serves about 20,000 meals a day across its hospitals, prisons, care facilities, and other institutions. And they have made it their goal to convert that food to organic food that is locally produced, so as to promote both healthy eating and also the local suppliers who are farming using organic methods. Another example is the city of Prague, which has 400 hectares of land that are considered part of the city within the city boundary. And they have, as part of their study into their food system, they realized that they need to promote more organic farming, and they make it a condition that if anybody wants to farm on this land within the city's boundaries, they have to farm in organic ways. The second next level role that cities can look at is to promote low carbon leisure options. So in many parts of the world, there's a a norm that people fly to go on holiday, or for a mini break, or it's just so easy these days. But there are a number of things that cities can do to try and keep people from traveling further by plane, and to enjoy the amenities within the city as an alternative to flying. So this includes looking at adding or improving local leisure options. As Vanessa mentioned earlier, this public luxury idea, how can you make your public spaces really inviting and make people want to spend more time there? You could also look at working with local leisure providers like hotels and restaurants, helping them to shift their services in a more sustainable direction, or to work together to package deals that consumers can benefit from. And then also looking at supporting local arts and culture, so that there are more events throughout the year that attract people to spend time in the city and deter them from leaving at whenever they have holidays. So one example of this is in London. They've developed a green London pocket map that basically lays out all the attractions across the city that in some way relate to sustainability. So it's a lot about promoting the parks and getting people to experience the green spaces in the city, but also sustainable restaurants, vegetarian restaurants, hotels that are very energy conscious, public bikes, a number of other things that if you were a holiday maker or a new person visiting the city, this could really help you to have a more sustainable experience than would otherwise have been the case. Another example is Victoria's Be a Local Tourist campaign, which provided discounts and free experiences for people to enjoy time in the city rather than having to travel elsewhere. The third role is supporting sustainable innovation and experimentation. Often the solutions for sustainability really need a degree of experimentation to try and find solutions that work for the local context. They're not simple plug-and-play solutions that one can necessarily borrow from elsewhere. And there are a number of different ways that cities can look at this. For example, innovation districts that have the express purpose of encouraging innovation and connection between innovators. There's also living labs where cities can work with local academic and research institutions to experiment and co-create solutions in rapid prototyping in public spaces or public institutions. There can also be challenge prizes where there's a specific issue that the city wants to solve and offers up a prize to various innovators or researchers to come up with solutions that work for the context. And then also this idea of pop-ups or tactical urbanism, where you experiment with little interventions, see how they work, and then decide whether to implement them permanently. So an example that was mentioned earlier is the pop-up cycle lanes in Berlin and other cities during COVID, which gave people an opportunity to experience a different way of moving through the city that many cities actually decided to implement as a permanent measure afterwards. Another example is Malmö in Sweden, where they've experimented with different types of neighborhoods, focusing on different themes. For example, climate adaptation, renewable and recycled energy, the sharing economy, or the SDGs. Another example is Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where they've really tried to build the image of the city as an innovating city, where they have the Blue City Incubator that looks at circular economy innovations, the Street Lab that looks at public space innovations. And this illustration here shows one of the innovations in water management, because Rotterdam used to regularly suffer from floods, where they developed these submerged sports courts that during most of the year are dry, but if you have a period of heavy rain, they fill up with water and allow the water to move more slowly out of the city, preventing flooding of residential areas. Another thing cities can look at is how city staff could act as ambassadors for high quality sustainable living. Now, we often see in the media examples of celebrities over-consuming, leading quite a bad example of how to live a life, which unfortunately shapes aspirations for many young people. And we believe that there's a big role that city leaders and staff can play in terms of promoting more sustainable living and making it more of a norm or an aspiration. For example, the mayor of New York is a strong advocate for plant-based foods. He himself is a vegan, and he's involved in a number of campaigns to promote healthier eating choices in his city. Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, is known for cycling to and fro from work on his bicycle, and thus showing that people of all statuses are welcome on the bicycle, and that it's not just for lower income groups to use non-motorized transport. The City of Vancouver provides discounts for staff to travel on public transport, and facilities like bicycle racks and showers to encourage people to cycle to and from work. The fifth next level intervention is looking at the defaults in society and making sustainability the default. How do we make it more convenient to take the sustainable option? So some areas of intervention here are providing more sustainable options. An easy example there would be public bicycles or public transport. Improving the convenience of these sustainable options. So there you can look at, for example, your public transport depots, making them really beautiful, well signposted, easy to access, with nice greenery, making it really inviting for people to want to use those facilities as opposed to others. Incentives and disincentives, looking at, for example, congestion charging in the city center, so that it's really an inconvenience to drive your car into the city center, opening the space up for people to walk and cycle more. And then also choice editing, looking at how do we phase out those defaults that encourage unsustainable behavior without necessarily making people feel like they're having options taken away from them, shifting the balance in terms of what is convenient and what is inconvenient. An example is Shenzhen's all-electric bus fleet, where they've converted all of their public buses to electricity, and they've also converted all of their taxis to electricity. So when you catch public transport in the city, you don't actually have to choose between fossil fuels or electric, it's already electric. And I heard an example earlier from North Vancouver where they're starting to look at garbage trucks, where those are converting to electricity along with the public transport. Another example is Helsinki Sustainable Catering, where now at all city meetings, events, and functions, they provide sustainable, locally sourced vegetarian meals. All their hot drinks come with oat milk instead of dairy milk. And the only meat that they serve is locally caught sustainable fish sometimes. So through that, they are establishing a new default that if you're at city meetings, you have to make a real extra effort to try and add animal-based products to your meal. A recent example from Wales is that they have, as part of their wellness index, they realized that continuing to invest in highways was actually detrimental to the well-being of their citizens. And they decided instead to rather halt all new highway building projects and rather plow that money into public transport and facilities for walking and cycling, which is a really significant scale intervention, but really exciting to see what some countries are able to do, and also the importance of looking at measures other than GDP to determine what is worthwhile investing in. The sixth next level role is looking at expanding, regenerating, and maintaining spaces for nature. So this is about enabling citizens to spend more time in nature and experience the benefits of the green spaces in the city as an alternative to having to hide away in air-conditioned shopping malls and other activities that are more consumption-oriented. So this involves protecting natural areas from development, which many cities are already trying to do, building green corridors so that people can commute on foot or by bicycle between areas in tree-lined corridors and green areas alongside rivers and other water bodies, and then planting and cleanup events where you can encourage citizens to get out there and contribute towards planting trees, cleaning up rivers and beaches, and making the public space more appealing for everybody to use. An example here is Athens, that has an ambitious plan to expand its green spaces by 25% to help with the urban heat island effect that they're experiencing with climate change. And this involves not only planting new trees, but also lifting pavement in certain areas to reduce the amount of hard surfaces in the city, and also refurbishing, I think it's about 36 fountains throughout the city to cool the air and create more attractive environments for people to spend their time during their lunch break or when commuting on foot through the city. Another example is Basel in Switzerland, that requires all new buildings to have green roofs, which is also quite an ambitious step. But through this initiative, they've already expanded the green space in the city by 1 million square meters. And this not only has an effect on the local microclimates and in terms of stormwater runoff, but also creates beautiful places for people to spend their breaks, to look out onto, and creates a calmer, more appealing feeling in the city and a better connection with nature, not to mention benefits for insects and other species. The 7th of the 8 next level roles is focusing on advertising, shifting advertising to divert attention from high carbon activities and consumption. So as Vanessa showed earlier, Grenoble is a city that's banned public advertising, but there are a number of interesting initiatives that are following suit, where cities are starting to look at restrictions on public advertising and also deliberate campaigns in public spaces to promote certain behaviors. So for example, in 2019, London banned junk food advertising from public spaces. The city of Haarlem in the Netherlands will next year be banning the advertising of factory farmed meat in public spaces. So those are some interventions on the food side. Amsterdam in 2021 banned advertising of fossil fuel vehicles and cheap air flights from public spaces. And this also is a subtle way in which you're not telling people what to do, but you're just reminding them less of damaging behaviors that really are counterintuitive to sustainable living. Another example is the Foodwise campaign in Hong Kong, where they worked with citizens and restaurants and other institutions in the food industry to promote a reduction in food waste and a better use of food in the city, which had a large impact in terms of reductions of organic waste to landfill. The final of the 8 next level roles is building a low impact culture. And this is perhaps one of the most important, but also one of the more challenging ones to do, is how do you really embed this sustainable living in culture so that it's not just a passing fad, that it becomes part of the way people do things and shapes their aspirations, their norms, their behaviors. So different ways that you can look at doing this is looking at celebrations, events, and traditions in the city. How can you work with what already happens and shift those towards more sustainable options? Looking at leading in Indigenous communities and the practices that they bring with them and what can be learned from those, so that these practices can be elevated and brought into part of a sustainable culture and identity for the city. Engaging with the arts and media. How do you bring these topics up in theatre, in music? How can you create an awareness and make these topics more spoken about in the city? And then also, how do we imagine futures for the city? How do we vision what the good life is and what we want from the city? So an example of this is Bogota's Ciclovia, which happens every week, where they close off, I think it's 120 kilometers of roads in the city to allow people to experience the city on a bicycle. And this has become such a part of the city's culture and has significantly increased the number of people cycling, which in turn has increased political support for cycling, because people now say, well, why can't we have this all the time? And the city's done some amazing work in terms of rolling out cycling infrastructure, particularly to low-income areas where it's perhaps needed most, to allow people to get to and from work. Another example is Metro Vancouver with its Create Memories Not Waste campaign, where they focused on the Christmas season or the festive season and looked at a number of ways in which that period of high consumption could be shifted towards a lower consumption but equally festive season. So looking at things like recycling gift paper, making your own gifts, different types of meals made from leftover food, just different ways in which you can leverage the occasion to promote more sustainable options. This is an example of a visioning exercise I was involved in a few years ago, looking at two trajectories that African cities could pursue. There's a lot of attention going into smart cities, where overseas providers are swooping in, selling smart city solutions that as a panacea to the many challenges faced by Africa's cities. And through this exercise, we looked at creating images of what two trajectories might look like as a starting point for discussion about what people in African cities actually want. And this image here was an example of the so-called smart city, where everything is highly automated, where humans don't really have a role in the city, where it's highly securitized, and the city center becomes an enclave for business and for wealthy business people to fly in and out, whilst the poor live on the urban periphery underneath the wind turbines. So this was kind of one option that was painted. Another option looked at how we could look at bringing residential areas into the city center, creating opportunities for small businesses in the city center so that they didn't have to commute as much, removing cars and bringing public transport and cycling infrastructure into the city center, along with renewable energy, shade from trees, and other options. So this is another way in which engagement with citizens can be visualized, and discussions about what people really want from the city can be facilitated. So I'm going to hand over to Vanessa to wrap up and for the discussion.
Thank you. And I know some of you need to, so thanks, Claudia, for being here. And yes, thank you so much, Blake, for that overview. And just to say another two things. First, the Create Memories Not Garbage campaign, among others, like the Love Food, Hate Waste campaign, is also something that people can pick up in your city and town, and just basically add your city logo and use. So these are freely usable campaigns that you don't need to redesign. You can just bring into your community. So those are really great for building that cultural demand. And so I just wanted to mention that, and also to say in the Netherlands, there's a countrywide garage sale that happens on King's Day every year. That's really an interesting cultural practice, and people save their goods and the children save their toys to have that countrywide garage sale. I'd love to do that in Canada, but maybe we start it in the cities and towns. So there's a few minutes for our conversation. And so the discussion question we wanted to ask you, which I'll put in the chat, is what next level opportunities are you already implementing, or which ones are you interested in exploring to support sustainable living? I'll just put the list here also in the chat, and I'll just show this to you on our slides here. But I'd love to hear from you as to what you think is kind of an interesting next step, next level opportunity that you've already engaged with, or one that you feel is promising. Here it is again, just to give you a sense of this question. What are you interested in implementing or exploring further? So I've got the question there in the chat, so I'll first go back to all so we can see each other. Yes, who would like to go first? Yes, Rhiannon.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Yeah, we're implementing a lot of different things at the City of Victoria. I think just to list a few, so Ambassadors for Sustainable Living, I would say one of our things is we purchased a significant number of reusable containers for takeout for staff, and we've stocked a lot of our staff kitchens with these reusable containers. So now when people go out and grab lunch, they're not bringing back, at least we're encouraging them. Some people are slower to catch on, but now it's kind of like monkey see, monkey do, and lots of people are catching on now. So we're doing that, which is great. We have a big staff barbecue coming up, and instead of having takeout, we're bringing these containers as well to reuse. We also have, like North Vancouver, a deconstruction bylaw. So looking at unbuilding homes and reusing materials and wood instead of the wood waste going into the landfill. So really, again, incorporating that reuse into our circular economy. we're starting to host more in-person events to really bring people together. So we have circular economy speaker series events, and we're going to have one on food waste actually later in the year. And we're actually going to like bring food in and make it like this more community building experience, and bring people together that way. I think nature regeneration, I'm less involved with. That's more of like our parks department, but I know that we're pretty on top of that. And then we also sit on the Destination Greater Victoria Sustainability Committee. And so we're trying to work with them I really like this idea of the low carbon leisure. Right now we're applying for, or we just received biosphere certification, but I think really encouraging that like staycation is a really great thing. Yeah, lots of other stuff that I could discuss, but I'll leave some room for others to mention their initiatives.
Thank you so much. That's super exciting. And also when you're saying about the Parks Department being on top of nature regeneration, in the city of Vancouver, we also connected newcomer sustainability practices to experiences in nature through the arts. And so they actually were doing some of those activities that Blake was mentioning, but as a way of feeling a connection to place and then connecting that to the behaviors that they're working on. So this is another example of how those silo bridging is really powerful for shaping the way people see their place and see their daily lives. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let's hear from somebody else. Just a couple of 1 or 2 reflections on these next level opportunities or what you're doing. Yes, who would like to go next? Yes, go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, thanks. We received some Reddit funding earlier in the year to support our circular economy work, and the piece that sort of aligns with this from this next level opportunity is this Ambassadors for Sustainable Living. So we pitched for the grant was something called the Trailblazer campaign, and so the idea is to identify business people who will act as examples for others through their involvement in the program. So the idea is to actually take them through waste audits, waste training, micro grants to support the development of their waste practices within their businesses, opportunities for innovation. There's going to be 3 innovation competitions. And so anyway, so it really aligns quite well with that, the Ambassadors for Sustainable Living. And that the basis for that program was really, after I'd seen a presentation on the shift behaviour change methodology using influencers as a key motivator for behaviour change.
That's great. And I think what's been interesting, Jen, about what you're saying is that those ambassadors can play 2 roles: greening of their business, but it's also a place, as we heard just now in the city of Victoria, of actually practicing and exemplifying sustainable everyday living practices. Like, how do we support both? And we've got a workplaces guide on sustainable lifestyles that I'll put in the chat that might help trigger some of those ideas, ambassadors.
Thank you.
Rhiannon, you're also saying that the Get Growing program in Victoria is really about converting your greenhouses into food growing operations and distributing food seedlings through community partners to residents to be part of that as well. That's great. Wonderful. And I think that we're at this is the last 2 minutes of the webinar. So at this point, thank you all so much. We'd love to hear more of the examples. If you have a moment, put them in the chat. If there's something else that stands out, but I will be back in touch and want to hand it over to Cora to complete the webinar.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. And thank you to Vanessa and Blake, our guest speakers. It's great to have all of you here. We'll be in touch with next steps on future webinars and also sharing some of the results that we shared with you. There'll be a toolkit that we'll be releasing in the coming months that you'll be able to have access to. So thanks again for everybody joining us today. It's great to see everyone.